name is Michael Scher, which I think you can see in very small letters over there. Very small. This is the first of, I hope will be a series of interesting lectures on Scandinavia, mostly on the various destinations that we are going to, as well as one on the Vikings. Today's lecture, as you can see, is on World War II in the north, the Scandinavian campaign in 1940, and it will also continue with some words on the occupation by the Germans in Norway and in Denmark. Before I start, I'd like to just say a few words about myself, as this is our first acquaintance. I have my PhD in Russian history from the University of Wisconsin in the United States. I was teaching for a few years in the United States, and then I went to Hong Kong, where I taught for about 20 years, almost 20 years, at the University of Hong Kong, again, modern European and Russian history. And I was retired from Hong Kong. They have a very early retirement policy there. And so I was retired in 2008, and I have moved over to neighboring Macau, a very tiny enclave, best known for gambling. And I'm now teaching at the University of Macau, which does not have such a rigid retirement policy. I have taught World War II quite a number of times at several different institutions, and I was thinking last night when the first time I taught World War II, and it goes back to 1980, some 30 years ago. And I hope my lectures are a little bit better today than what they were then. What we will do today is first I'm going to show you a very short 2.5-minute video on the conflict that I got from YouTube, and then I will have the lecture with PowerPoint accompanying. So let me just start the video and let me work it through if I could. Let me just see if I can do this correctly. First, I must quit the PowerPoint, and now I go to the video and go to the big screen.
The next major German offensive was directed not at France, but Scandinavia. In April 1940, German troops moved to occupy Denmark and Norway. They were sent to protect Germany's supplies of iron ore, which were shipped out from Sweden through the Norwegian port of Narvik. By occupying Norway, Germany would also secure bases for air attacks against Allied shipping in the North Sea and keep the Royal Navy from the Baltic. The Allies had already realized that severing Germany's iron ore supply would cripple the Nazi war machine, and they were simultaneously planning their own operation in Norway. The Germans narrowly won the ensuing race. On April the 9th, German troops landed at Kristiansund, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. Supporting airborne assaults were made against Oslo and Stavanger. This was the first major air-land-sea operation in history. On the same day, and in the space of 4 hours, the Germans occupied Denmark. By April the 16th, Germany controlled most of southern Norway. Despite heroic resistance, Norway's largely militia army had been unable to prevent the German capture of their coastal cities. Over the next 3 days, British and French troops landed at Namsos, Narvik and Andelsnes. In the south, they advanced as far as Lillehammer, but were then repulsed and had to be withdrawn by early May. In the north, they pushed the Germans out of Narvik. However, the Allied campaign was doomed by poor coordination, especially between the navy and infantry, while the total air supremacy achieved by the Luftwaffe proved decisive. The outcome of the Norwegian campaign was a foregone conclusion. Even before the fighting had finished there, the Germans were preparing to launch their greatest gamble of all, the invasion and conquest of the West.
Now let me just go back to the PowerPoint. Move that. And then no, I don't want that. Okay, that was a little introduction to the Norwegian campaign. Let's see, get the slide. Very good, thank you. Now, on September 1st, 1939, the Germans invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II began on the flat, dry plains of Poland. The world, incredibly, almost breathed a sigh of relief. For nearly 2 years, the preceding 2 years, people on both sides had lived a very curious, very tense life of no war, no peace. At least now, in September 1939, people knew they were at war. But it would be a very curious first few months. As predicted, the Germans conquered Poland very quickly, yet along the Western Front, basically between France and Germany, there was little or no fighting. Many people on both sides, in fact, wondered if they were actually at war. The only real battle between the Allies and the Germans was on the seas. And the only real war on land took place between two nations, nominally not on either side, namely Finland and the Soviet Union, what we call the Winter War. That bloody conflict between a David and a Goliath caught the attention of the world. Little Finland, 4 million people, fought bravely against incredible odds. The West nearly went to war against the Soviet Union, a fact which would have had huge, unpredictable effects for the rest of the war had it occurred. That war brought the attention of the world to the strategic importance of Scandinavia. That would become the next major arena. Surprising all, the Germans launched a massive amphibious assault by their navy, backed by air support by their air force, or as we call the Luftwaffe, against Denmark and Norway, which you just saw on your screen. Now, let me just go forward. Scandinavia was crucial for both sides. Its geographical location made it inevitable that one or the other side would try to take it over. Now, again, I'm going to go back to the preceding slide. Denmark dominated the entrance to the Baltic Sea right here, with its great port of Leningrad at the eastern edge. The key to northeastern Europe. Norway fronted the North Sea right here. Its fjords, harbors, and ports would make for excellent submarine bases to launch attacks on Britain, as well as later assaults on Allied assistance to the Soviet Union, which basically would go from Britain through the north of Europe to Murmansk in the Soviet Union over there. I'm asking you to use your imagination a little. And that would be after the German attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941. Norway also offered the sea route for the transport of rich Swedish iron ore necessary for the German war effort, which would come from Narvik, from northern Sweden to Narvik by train, and then down the North Sea to Germany. One of Hitler's top aides, Admiral Raeder, shown here with Hitler, recognized that his prize navy would play a major role in any Scandinavian invasion, ferrying troops and supplies, as well as defending German forces from an advancing British attack. Up to now, the German Navy had played almost no part in the war, as both sides regarded Scandinavia as essential. Its neutrality was threatened right from the start. British leader Winston Churchill pressed for the mining of Norwegian harbors and the Norwegian coast to prevent the ferrying of supplies going along the Norwegian coast, particularly the Swedish iron ore. The British planned to start mining the Norwegian coast in April. That would be followed by the landing of British troops at several Norwegian ports. The British also sought to invade Norway to take the nearby Swedish iron ore. Both sides planned a sudden conquest of Norway, but The Germans were quicker. Hitler feared a British push down Norway to Germany. At this point, Admiral Raeder drew the attention of Hitler to the strategic advantage of controlling Norway. But still, Hitler hesitated to act. Hitler basically wanted to invade the West, knock France out of the war, and then his plan was to conclude a peace with Britain. Yet, when Hitler got wind of Allied plans to move into northern Scandinavia, he then decided to act. Hitler gave the orders to attack the north on March 1st. Again, Admiral Raeder, the admiral in charge of the Navy, with Hitler. Now, the Scandinavian campaign, the German invasion of Norway and Denmark was a masterpiece. Suddenly, on April 7th, 1940, the Germans moved huge, heavily protected troop and equipment convoys up the Norwegian coast. Those convoys you saw in the film clip. Much of the British Navy was still at port in Scotland. In the race for Scandinavia, the British never stood a chance. The plan was called Operation Weser. It is actually a shortened form for a much longer German name that I dare not try to pronounce. The plan was for the Germans to take the Norwegian ports and airfields through simultaneous air and sea operations. The naval action would be Germany's largest for the entire war. Simultaneously, Denmark would be occupied by land and sea. Denmark surrendered within hours with little or no resistance. Basically, the people said, we don't stand a chance, so forget about it. In that battle, or so-called battle, 16 Danish troops died in the nearly bloodless invasion, as basically the government believed, rightly, that resistance was futile. The Norwegian army, although very well trained, numbered less than 15. That's 15,000. They could, at best, delay, not stop the Germans. Norway itself was largely unprepared for the German military invasion when it came on the night of April 9th and 10th. Let me just see if I've got a map. Okay. Within 12 hours, the Germans secured the major ports and airfields. Within 24 hours, the Germans had taken Oslo, Bergen, where we will be stopping, and Trondheim. Within 24 hours, little or no resistance through its advanced detachments. A single parachute battalion took Oslo's airport. The first time that parachutes were employed in warfare. The first troops entering Oslo followed a military brass band. On establishing footholds in Oslo and Trondheim, the Germans then launched ground offensives against scattered resistance by the Norwegians inland. Allied forces attempted several counterattacks with little success. Basically, the world stood by, astounded at the speed and the daringness of the German operation. Only the Norwegian government and the royal family managed to escape. Only in northern Norway, basically Narvik, way up here. We will be going up to Narvik, and we will be going, as you know, way up here. Only in that area did the Allies have a glimmer of hope. There, at Narvik, the British Navy counterattacked on April 14th. A bruising series of land, sea, and air battles followed. From the start, the Germans outgunned, outmanned, and had air superiority over the Allies. That made British bases, British lines of communication impossible. By late May, the Allies conquered Narvik. But it was merely symbolic. By that point, the Germans were storming through the Low Countries, basically down here, below where the map is. Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. With that invasion of the Low Countries, the Allies needed every troop they had. So, as a result, by early June, the Allies evacuated Narvik only 10 days after their victory there. The war in Scandinavia was over. On June 10th, the last Norwegian division surrendered. While casualties were light on both sides, no more than 7,000 troops died. The Norwegians withstood the Germans the longest time of any enemy or any country that the Germans had invaded, roughly 2 months. However, British air and naval attacks cost the Germans most of their surface ships, including 2 of the Germans' great battleships. When the Germans faced the prospects of an amphibious assault on Britain in the months ahead, they had to do with basically no surface fleet. That fact was crucial in allowing Britain to win the decisive Battle of Britain in the months ahead in the fall and winter of 1940 and 41. Let me move forward. This is a slide showing you German tanks in Denmark, I think in Copenhagen. Germans advancing on a Norwegian village. Germans disembarking in Norway. You see the ship right here, the German troops in the foreground. Again, a map of the Norwegian invasion, which again I showed you, Oslo down here, Bergen up here, Trondheim, Narvik way up here. Let me just go back one. No, I want to go forward. I want to go forward, back. Now, the Norwegians and the Danes lost their independence. The Germans lost much of their surface fleet. The British lost their government. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, the architect of the prior British policy of appeasement, fell from power. The British thought that Norway could easily be protected by the Great British Navy. The German operation in Scandinavia was a psychological catastrophe for the British. Chamberlain was discredited for what was perceived as his mismanagement of the campaign. Conservatives in the British Parliament deserted him. The British turned to Winston Churchill on May 10th, almost the exact date that Belgium and Netherlands were invaded. Churchill had been in the political wilderness for years because of his advocacy of a strong anti-Nazi policies throughout the 1930s. Churchill then formed a coalition government. It was called a national government. The war would bring out Churchill's greatest. Ironically, Churchill was selected because he was virtually a last resort leader. The British were kind of desperate at that point. What did the Germans gain from the invasion? The most tangible benefit was the assurance of iron ore from Sweden. Furthermore, German control of Denmark and Norway ensured that Sweden did everything the Germans demanded, at least for the first 2 years of the war. Vast numbers of German troops traveled on Swedish trains to Norway and to neighboring Finland. The German Navy built warships in Swedish shipyards. Thousands of Norwegians and Danes worked in German munitions plants. Others served in the German army, particularly in the German Waffen-SS. German submarines and surface ships used Norwegian ports to sink British shipping, and later on, prevent Allied supplies to the Soviet Union, and they did that for the rest of the war. Finally, the United States government and population were shocked by the invasion. Its speed and the seeming German invincibility, even in the face of the great British Navy. The U.S., as a result, would move closer to war, as it would occupy the Danish territories of Iceland and Greenland for the rest of the war and use them as military bases. Now, this is Narvik Harbor. These are sinking or already sunk German ships in the harbor, sunk by British planes. Narvik in flames after German bombing. Basically the city, and I think we will be visiting Narvik. I think we will be stopping there. It is basically a post-World War II city. It was almost entirely destroyed during the war. A scene of Winston Churchill in his office. Now, the German occupation and resistance in Denmark and Norway. I should point out the two nations had very different experiences under German occupation. The occupation for both lasted until the end of the war, May 1945. Now, in terms of Denmark, contrary to the situation in all other countries under German occupation, most Danish institutions continued to function quite normally until 1943. The Danish government, its parliament, the Danish king, all continued to remain in the country. They operated under a very uneasy cooperative arrangement with the German military. The police and the courts remained in Danish hands. Most Danes backed the new government, the new order, hoping that they could retain control of their country. The Danish government protected its small Jewish population as long as it could, refusing constant German demands to persecute them. As the war dragged on, the Danish population became increasingly hostile to the Germans. After German losses to the Soviets at the Battle of Stalingrad in January-February 1943, the incidence of Danish resistance increased rapidly. Nevertheless, in March 1943, the Germans allowed the Danes to hold a general election. It was, in fact, the only case of a fully fair and free election in Nazi-occupied Europe. In that election, the Danish Nazi Party received all of 2% of the vote. Strikes and civil unrest increased. As a result, in August 1943, the Germans declared martial law throughout Denmark. From that point on, the Germans essentially ran Denmark. After the fall of the government, Denmark was then exposed to the full fury of the Nazis. In October 1943, the Germans planned to deport Denmark's 7,000 Jews to the death camps operating at full speed in Poland. However, most Danish Jews were transported to safety in small fishing boats and motorboats over a 3-day period. The resistance movement within Denmark continued to grow. In June 1944, Denmark managed to disrupt the rail system, preventing German troops from going to Normandy. Let me just see, where am I? Yeah. A general strike broke out in Copenhagen during the summer of 1944. So in this way, you can say how the Danes contributed to the success of the Allies in their D-Day landings. British bombings destroyed the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen in March 1945. Most of Denmark was only liberated at the end of the war in May 1945 by British troops commanded by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. An anti-German protest in Copenhagen. This is a photo of the evacuation of Denmark's Jews. A photo of King Christian X riding his horse through the streets of Copenhagen. And he became a revered symbol of Denmark. He very proudly would show his face in the streets throughout the occupation. Now to move to Norway. Unlike Denmark, the Norwegian government and king did not stay in the country. Instead, they fled to Britain, where they set up a government in exile. The members of the Norwegian parliament also refused to cooperate. Only Vidkun Quisling, the leader of the Norwegian Nazi Party, he wanted to become Norway's new prime minister, but he had absolutely no support or credibility by the Norwegian people. And the Germans recognized that. So for that reason, the German Reich Kommissar, Josef Terboven, became the real man in charge, with Quisling only nominally. Norway was the most heavily fortified country during the war. Several 100,000 German troops were stationed in Norway. It was considered by the Germans a fairly cushy posting. And if German troops got out of line, they would be sent east to fight the Soviets. Under German occupation, Norway lost all of its major trading partners. As a result, the Norwegian people confronted a scarcity in basic goods, including food. As a result, food shortages increased as people depended on rations. People grew what they could in city parks, in their backyards, any place where they could find a bit of land. About 1/3 of Norway's small Jewish population died in the Holocaust in camps. The rest fled to Sweden and Britain. About 15,000 Norwegians volunteered for the German army and the German SS. Most, I should point out, were sent to the Eastern Front to fight the Soviet Union. On the other hand, a much greater number of Norwegians took part in armed resistance or supporting people who were actively engaged in the resistance. Over time, an organized resistance movement numbering some 40,000 people, all armed, developed a largely unified command system. These members of the Norwegian resistance conducted sabotage, raids, and clandestine operations against the German forces. Among their activities included the crippling of an emerging German nuclear energy project. Ships, trains, railway tracks were all destroyed. About 80,000 Norwegians fled the country during the war. The Norwegian Army, Navy, and Air Force continued to function, conducting operations against German operations in Norway. In late 1944, a small Norwegian force set sail for the far north to the Soviet port of Murmansk to join Soviet troops that were at that stage entering northern Norway, an area, again, that we will be going to called Finnmark. Norwegian forces slowly took back battered regions, helping the local population get through a horrible, horrible winter. Towards the end of the war, Nazi Reich Commissar Josef Terboven considered plans to make Norway the last bastion of the Third Reich. In other words, a place to continue the war after the war. However, following Hitler's suicide on April 30th, Hitler's successor, Admiral Dönitz, let me just move us forward. Admiral Dönitz told Terboven, you gotta surrender. When the war is over, it's over. When Terboven refused a direct command of Admiral Dönitz, Dönitz then transferred command to General Franz Böhm, head of the German forces in Norway. He surrendered to Allied forces as well as to the Norwegian resistance, which had taken control of Oslo itself on May 8th. All German and Norwegian Nazis were then interned and imprisoned. During the next couple of months, members of the Norwegian government and its royal family returned from exile. Norway suffered extensive damage during the war, particularly in the far north, basically going from Narvik along the coast all the way, including Finnmark, at the top of Norway. Over 10,000 Norwegians died. Quisling was tried in August 1945, claiming at his trial that he tried to moderate the German occupation. He was found guilty and executed by a firing squad in October 24th, 1945, crying that he died an innocent man. No one in Norway mourned him. His old home today, I should point out, is a Holocaust museum. Norway would need time to rebuild. A few slides. Vidkun Quisling, Josef Terboven, the Nazi commander. He, by the way, refusing to surrender, blew himself up with dynamite. The surrender of the Germans, May 1945. And then these are some references, some books if you want to read about the Norwegian and Danish war. This one by Geir Haar, called The German Invasion of Norway, 2009. This one by T.K. Derry, The Campaign in Norway, 1984. And this one by Kersodi, Norway, 1940, came out in 1990. Now, I have a few minutes to answer questions, and I'd be happy to take a few. Any questions? Any questions? Yes, sir. No, I did not. I'm sorry. Yes.
But the real one was in Denmark by the Storstrømsbro, the Storstrøms Bridge. It's the German parachutists from Schongau took over in the very early morning of the 9th of April.
Okay. So in other words, the very first parachute operation was by the Germans against Denmark. Is that near Copenhagen? No.
The island Falster and the island Sjælland. Copenhagen is placed on Sjælland. So that was a very important bridge for the German further operation to take the Danish main island.
Okay, my correction on that.
And there was a fort there connected to the bridge, so that was important for the Germans to take that one, and they could only take it by air.
And then as the gentleman notes correctly, the Allied operation was not solely British. There were French troops there, and I should also point out there were Polish troops as well.
Another important thing is why Denmark was so came so easy through the war, and Norway was more than we did. I'm Danish. That was because of this incident that the Norwegian torpedoed the German warship Brügger by Drøbak on the Oslo escape.
Uh-huh.
Most Norwegian made resistance, they came under SS rule, like Poland, like France, like the Netherlands, like Belgium. But Denmark, we came under the Auswärtiges Amt, the German foreign minister, the Ribbentrop. That makes a whole difference.
So again,
Way the war, yeah.
so again, the occupations were quite different. I think one, as you point out, the Norwegian resistance right in the beginning, and that caused the Germans to govern Norway quite differently than they did Denmark. Because as you say, the Germans governed Denmark through the foreign ministry, which still had some decent, at least non-Nazi diplomats involved in it. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You didn't mention the great warships,
No, I did not. There was,
warships in the
in fact, one of the battleships, German battleships, I think the Tirpitz, which was sank in 1944. And then, as this gentleman here points out, I think it was the Blücher, was sunk in the Oslo harbor in the first days of the war. No, I mean, very simply, in a talk of 45 minutes, I cannot include everything. And I think I left out as much as I included in this. So really, yes, and I again apologize, just simply due to lack of time. Other questions? Yes, sir.
We might also mention that the word Quisling has entered the English language as a homeborn trader. It's become part of the language.
Yes. Again, as noted, the name Quisling, he became so reviled that the name has entered the English language as traitor, the same way as I should point out by Americans, the name Benedict Arnold has entered the American language as a word for traitor. Any other questions? Any other questions? Well, folks, I want to thank you very much for coming. I hope I've edified you. It's a little, I would say, a little heavy of a lecture to give on a cruise. I hope you don't mind. And I hope you come to my subsequent lectures, which I don't think will be on such a grim note as this. I hope they'll be a little bit lighter. But again, I want to thank you very much.